Hey, this is Elia Einhorn. Welcome to the Talkhouse Podcast. Today I'm sitting here with
Nick Dawson, Editor-in-Chief of Talkhouse Film.
On today's episode, we have Jim Hemphill in conversation with Leah Thompson.
Absolutely. Jim and Leah have been friends for a number of years. They worked together on the 2011 movie The Trouble with the Truth, which Jim wrote and directed and Leah starred in. And they were talking because Leah's feature directorial debut, The Year of Spectacular Man, is playing at the LA Film Festival on Friday, June 16th. Get tickets if you still can.
Probably sold out, but try.
Absolutely. Get in line, see if you can get in. So the movie is written by Leah's daughter, Maddie Deutsch, who stars in it with her sister, Zoe Deutsch, and also Leah. And the movie was produced by Leah's husband, Howard Deutsch. It's very much a family affair, which is very appropriate because it's actually about a family and contains some inter-family affairs. So it's sort of a Nora Ephron, Woody Allen 80s type romantic comedy.
Now, going back to the 80s, Leah tells some pretty amazing stories. Of course, this is the woman who starred in Back to the Future.
Right, as they say, a wholesome family comedy about incest.
She also starred in one of my childhood favorite movies, which in retrospect is a little bit disturbing, Howard the Duck.
And yeah, there's some really great stories about Howard the Duck, also about All the Right Moves and Tom Cruise. There's some meaty Tom Cruise stuff in this episode.
Let's just say the conversation went from being very wholesome in itself to a sort of NSFW moment very quickly.
Right. From what you told me, you kind of did a bit of a double take as that shift took place.
I did. So, to our listeners, if you're playing this in the office, just get ready for an awkward moment.
Play this in your office, but know that you will be pushing the limits of what is appropriate public discourse.
Now, getting back to Howard the Duck, there's a really interesting story here about how its failure at the box office led to some fantastic changes in Leah's life.
Right. The failure both critically and commercially of that movie led to Leah's career taking a bit of a hit, and she took a movie, Some Kind of Wonderful, which she'd previously turned down. The director of that movie, Howard Deutsch, shortly after became her husband.
And they touch on a lot of other stuff, including how great a corpse Jim is as an actor.
The reason Jim was digitally removed from an episode of The Fosters.
Sexism in Hollywood.
And making movies with your heroes. And of course, Leah was a hero to Jim when they made The Trouble with the Truth together.
On that note, this conversation starts with them talking about how they met.
On that movie.
Let's roll it.
I remember the first conversation we had about you doing the movie, I was at the Telluride Film Festival. I think you were on vacationing on Fire Island or something. And I got this phone call from Tommy, the producer of the movie. And we were a few weeks away from shooting, and we were trying to cast this thing because in typical independent film fashion, I'd gotten myself in this situation where the movie had to start by a certain date. And of course, we kind of had the date before we had a cast or crew or anything like that. And so anyway, Tommy calls me and he says, okay, I think Leah Thompson's in, but she wants to talk to you and make sure you're not crazy. So I remember having this conversation with you on the phone while I was standing in the middle of a road in Telluride at the film festival, trying to convince you to do the movie. And I remember saying to you, look, I can't really pay you anything, but it'll only be a couple of weeks out of your life. And then 2 or 3 years later, I still was calling you to come to come to the Twin Cities Film Festival in Minnesota to promote this movie. And, and so it was I didn't mean to lie to you at the time, but it was a lie that you would only be working with me for 2 weeks. I think there was a total of about 5 years where every few weeks I would be calling you to go to a film festival or do an interview or, something like that. But,
well, if I may say, it was a great pleasure.
Well,
it was one of the great pleasures of my career to do your film. You were amazing.
Well, thanks. It was, it was obviously a great pleasure for me too, and an interesting experience because it was the first time I ever made a movie with a real crew with professional actors. I mean, the first movie I made was this low budget horror film that we made for $10,000. And the crew was 3 people: me, the cinematographer, and the guy holding the boom mic. None of us had ever done the jobs we were doing. I mean, the cinematographer wasn't a cinematographer. The guy holding the boom mic was my college roommate. Just happened to, and also one of the shortest guys I knew, which didn't really make sense that he was our boom mic guy. But anyway, we were the crew of 3. All the actors. We had some very good actors, but they were all it was their first movie. It was set in high school, so it was all a bunch of 18-year-old actors who didn't know what they were doing. I didn't know what I was doing. And, I with Trouble with the Truth, I was definitely a little bit intimidated coming in to be working with you and John Shea. I mean, I've told this story before that when I was at USC Film School, Robert Zemeckis came to talk to my class, and he said that you were his favorite actor he had ever worked with. And that always really stuck with me because I thought this guy who's worked with, Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep and Michelle Pfeiffer and, a lot of, Denzel Washington, whatever. I mean, he's worked with all the big stars and lots of great actors. And so that always really stuck with me. And I always had this kind of fantasy that I would, make a movie with you someday. And then when I got to do it, I was the thing that made me a little bit nervous was actually knowing that both you and John Shea, the male lead, had directed. I mean, at that time you had, again, directed a bunch of TV movies and stuff. John had directed tons of theater and then an independent feature. And I think I was very, wary of, I was wondering, okay, are they going to, try to sort of, are they going to not trust, are they going to see that I don't know what I'm doing, basically, and try, and actually it was a great experience because you guys, I think it was the opposite. I think it was like what you were saying, you both sort of knew what I was up against. So you were only helpful. It was sort of like having an extra couple sets of eyes that would, if there was something I didn't get that I should, John would kind of be like, you might want to get this thing and you're going to want this in the editing room or whatever. But it was never pushy. It was always really, it was really helpful and great. But I guess, I'm curious, the thing that I always think about on that movie is I was by far the least experienced person on the set. I mean, I was the director and I'd spent far fewer hours on any set than anyone else there. And that's generally the case. I mean, even if you're Ridley Scott, you're probably, you've logged less hours on set than anybody else on your set, just because if you're a director, you're lucky if you get to make maybe a movie a year. And that's very few people even get to do that. Most of them, it's one every several years. Whereas your actors, your crew, they're doing, tons of stuff. And I guess my question for you is, having had this career, being on so many different sets, I mean, you've gotten to see so many different kinds of directors. There's Zemeckis, there's Eastwood, there's your husband, Howie Deutsch, there's, somebody like Michael Chapman, who directed All the Right Moves and wasn't really a director, he's a cinematographer who wasn't probably, based on what I've heard, the greatest with actors. And I'm curious, this is a huge question, but how does all of that inform the way you direct? I mean, what do you do as a director, I guess, to kind of facilitate the best performances from people?
Well, it is a really unique position. You're talking about, I mean, the amount of directors I've worked with is probably, I've worked with great TV directors too. I mean, I did 1 million episodes with James Burrows, who's the most famous sitcom director. And I've worked with a lot of great directors, a lot of women directors. So it does give me a unique perspective on directing, and more so I learned more from the bad ones, how easy it is to alienate actors because they're so sensitive, and how important it is to just make sure that the crew knows that you're there for them, that you're, especially the actors, that you've got their backs, and also to give them permission. It's like shocking how many directors don't give you permission to just do your thing. Instead, they kind of make you like self-conscious, which is a complete disaster. Like, why would anybody do that to somebody? Oftentimes you'll find yourself, in my TV movie phase, you've been raped and, your child's being taken from you or whatever. And they're just like, okay, action. And you're like, you're scared to like go for it. Like what in any way, shape or form, like a person would really go for it. So it's about giving permission. It's about, all the obvious stuff about where you put the camera and all that stuff. I learned a lot about production because not only have I been in 1 million things, I've been the star of 1 million things. And when you're the star, you're there all day.
Yeah.
And every single person who doesn't do their job well affects you in a way that you can see. When you come in and you kind of do a scene, you go back to your trailer, you don't really get the whole feeling of what's going on the set and what's going wrong. And, everything that goes wrong makes it worse for you. A scene that makes no sense, bad props, bad lighting, everything makes it harder and worse for you. So you learn about production. And I learned a lot about production. On my TV movies, I learned a lot about getting the biggest bang for your buck. And I think sometimes independent filmmakers, because they're inexperienced, they don't really understand how to get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of how and where you shoot things. And so I'm really into that. And, that was a big part of my movie, The Year of Spectacular Men, was really trying to make it look as big as possible with as little money as possible. And, I think that sounds not like woo-woo, like how I work with the actors, but I'm lucky because they naturally know I'm one of them.
Right.
So I don't have to work really hard at that.
Yeah.
Because I'm one of them. I get it. I understand. I'm not really intimidated by actors, which is a terrible thing. That's so many feature directors. Hopefully that breed is dying off now. But so many feature directors are just like either obviously dislike actors or just don't even... I can't stand them. Like, they don't want anything to do with them. And it's insane to me. Like, that's all that really matters. Things blowing up and all that, nobody cares. It's that moment when they go into the close-up and that guy goes, says the great line. Everybody remembers that.
And I am kind of constantly amazed when I hear about directors who don't like actors or don't want to talk to them or things like that. I mean, I was recently...
it's really common.
Yeah, I was shadowing on a TV series. I was the shadowing director on this TV series recently because I'm trying to break into directing episodic TV. And I was talking with some of the actors on that. And, they were telling me horror story after horror. I was asking them, what do you look for? And all of them just said the same thing, which was they just said somebody who talks to us.
Yeah.
And I said, don't they all talk to you? And they said, no. And somebody else on the show asked me, what kind of director are you? And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, are you an actor's director or are you a visual director? And I said, aren't you supposed to be both?
Yeah.
And,
that's just horrible.
But I think you're right. I mean, that was actually very much with the movie we made together. That was the pragmatic idea I had right from the beginning. I wrote it specifically with the idea of if everything else goes wrong, as long as I have two good actors, this movie will work. Basically, it was sort of designed.
Well, it was a great script.
Well, thanks. It was kind of designed to be that. It was sort of designed so that, like, well, if I don't have the money to make it look the way I want, or I'm shooting, we were shooting that movie in a studio that looked like something out of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. I mean, I don't know what that neighborhood we were. It was just like the ghetto of the desolate dregs of Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles. But I knew if I had actors like you and John, you would kind of, that's all like you say, anybody would care about. Yeah,
it's an interesting thing about movie making, and that's what's so great about it, diversifying, because in a world where it's just the same, a 40 to 50-year-old white guy directing movies, you're going to get one kind of, and writing them and producing them, you're going to get one kind of story, and it gets boring after a while. You need more people, you did a great job.
Thank you.
But you do need more people.
No,
with,
absolutely.
You're younger too. You're a younger generation. Like, I don't really experience a lot of sexism now as a director, except from the DPs, because they just seem to be the worst, like most stuck. So unfortunately, when I go to get a DP, I usually like a younger guy because they're not so sexist. Like, they're different. Guy in their 30s and 40s, early 40s, they're like, they see the world differently for the most part than these 50, 60, 70-year-old DPs. They're just really sexist, and it's very annoying.
Yeah, well, that actually leads me to another question. You mentioned that with actors, you kind of come in and they know you speak their language, so you don't maybe have the hurdles that some directors have to get over in terms of them trusting you. But does it work the opposite way with crew, with DPs, and with people on the crew? Is there a sort of, do you ever find that there's a sort of suspicion of you because it's like, oh, here comes some actor, coming in to direct?
I haven't felt that way because usually, I also have this advantage that I've usually worked with 2 or 3 people on the set. Right. And I have built good karma through years and years of being a decent fellow worker among workers. So I always have somebody that goes, she's cool, don't worry, she's going to be fine. So, that usually helps. And, I don't really feel like I get that too much, but I do get a little bit of starstruck sometimes. The fans of Back to the Future, whatever, they're like, oh my God. That just lasts for like 4.5 minutes and then it's over.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's sort of an interesting thing. Scorsese talks about this rule that if there's somebody who you work with who you saw in a movie before you turned 21, there's something different. You do have to get over that starstruck thing. Like he had it when he worked with Paul Newman on Color of Money, and you usually have it with other actors, but it was like Paul Newman. It was like, okay, I saw this guy when I was 14, and The Silver Chalice or whatever the hell it was, and I mean, I had that kind of experience with you a little bit. I mean, look, the first memory I have of seeing you on screen is watching you get fingered in a car by Tom Cruise. So that's sort of a strange,
Terrifying.
I saw.
Was that what was happening in that scene? I didn't know. I think that's your imagination.
Am I remembering it wrong? That's what I thought. I'm pretty sure that's what he was doing to you. And I don't know. Maybe I'm remembering. I mean, admittedly, I saw it sort of through closed fingers because I saw that movie with my grandmother, and she kept putting her hand over my eyes. So maybe I filled in. Maybe my imagination made it bigger than it was.
I have the distinction of being naked with Tom Cruise, except for we were wearing white socks.
And that's which
they
sort
had
of
to
a famous,
digitally kind of remove at that time when they couldn't.
They removed the socks.
No, they had to reframe it, which was a big deal in film at that time, I guess.
Yeah, they had to do it with an optical printer or something.
Yeah, they had to. It was expensive to get the white socks out.
Interesting.
Because it made everybody laugh, which would have been great.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because you had a nude scene in that movie with Tom Cruise. Isn't that the movie where he sort of famously, if you freeze it at just the right moment, you can see Tom Cruise's penis too?
Yes,
I think. Yeah.
It's like a big deal, and no one talks about me, but they talk about Tom Cruise's penis. Which brings me to another problem because in love scenes, guys are always like, I'm sorry if it happens and I'm sorry if it doesn't happen. Like it's either way. So I don't think it happened. So Tom Cruise is probably a little embarrassed about that little peek of his penis. I'm not sure. It was cold in that room. I've never looked at it, but I've heard about it. But he was a gentleman and an awesome guy. That scene was really interesting to me because there were 2 scenes in that movie where I was supposed to take my shirt off, and I didn't want to do the movie because I didn't want to take my shirt off. And they somehow convinced me to, and I literally had to take my shirt off in the audition, which was really weird and creepy. And I tried to make them really embarrassed about it. But the director said, Michael Chapman says, I don't want to be in the room for that. And I was like, get in the room. Like, if I have to take off my top, you have to be in here too.
He didn't want to be in the room for shooting or for the audition?
For the audition. He was like mortified. He was a kind of, like East Coast, like, dude.
Yeah, he's the guy who shot Taxi Driver and Raging Bull.
Yeah.
But who was it that wanted you to do that?
I think the studio wanted to see if I would do it, and B, if I had nice boobs. I get it. If I was in the same position, I'd probably ask for the same thing. But I didn't. So I got there, and there were these 2 scenes. That scene where I'm in the car getting fingered, apparently. At that scene, I was supposed to take my top off, and then there was the whole love scene. And Tom Cruise was really sweet. He fought really hard for me not to take my top off in that scene. And then he said when we did that other scene that we were, the whole key about these love scenes, at the time there was always, a girl was always taking her top off in every movie at that point. And, they don't do it so much anymore. They just do it on HBO.
Right.
But Tom was really smart about it. He was like, we ought to make this a scene about something. And it's actually a really somber scene. And he said, if she has to take off her clothes, I'll take off my clothes, which was really sweet. I mean, really, he didn't have to. It wasn't negotiated that way. And I also remember Jan de Bont was on the ground shooting it. Great DP. Yeah. And he was like, no one was in the room. He goes, do you have any body makeup on? And I was like, no, what's body makeup? And he went, okay, action. But I was 21, so didn't need it at the time.
What was the reaction to that movie when it came out? I mean, because again, it's interesting, these movies that you did pre Back to the Future, I saw all of them, Jaws 3D, All the Right Moves, Red Dawn, Wildlife. I saw them in the theater as a kid when they came out, but, at that point I was of an age where I just loved movies, but I had no idea about anything, business-wise. I had no idea which of them were doing well, which of them weren't. And All the Right Moves, I remember, had a really big effect on me. I mean, I thought you and Cruise were both fantastic. It felt like a sort of more, as you say, it was a more somber, serious teen film, than people were used to. I mean, that was the era of Porky's and Class and things like that, which I like those movies, but it just All the Right Moves had an almost more, Martin Ritt kind of feel to it or something. And was it well received, and was it a movie that you got any attention for at the time, or?
A little bit, I guess, but it didn't make that much money. I know it was a disappointment. Yeah, I mean, they specifically went for that. Like we had to call a cover set if the sun was out because they wanted it to look like a depressing, steel mill town. And, it's interesting is the same theme. I mean, that was 34 years ago. And the same theme is going on in America right now, like the dying of these kind of big industrial jobs. And were they really worth having anyway? Like who really wants to go down in a coal mine, honestly? Wouldn't you rather be putting up solar panels? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, isn't that a better job? Than working in these huge factories where people are dying in flames, but those are the questions that they, were very interesting at that point for the filmmakers. And it was a disappointment, and it was really interesting because I didn't really know much about acting. I mean, I'm okay in that movie, I think, but I think a lot of people thought that they just found me and that's who I was. They didn't know I was this modern dancer, ballerina, like they thought they found me in a coal mine and gave me a job, which actually is a compliment.
I was going to say, I think it's a testament. You say that you weren't necessarily that great in it, but I think that's a testament to how good you are in it. I mean, I think you're, I actually, two of my favorite early performances of yours actually are that and another movie that I know you are kind of mystified by my fondness for, which is The Wildlife, which I don't know if people listening to this are familiar with it because it's kind of fallen into obscurity, but it was, but it was an interesting movie. It was written by Cameron Crowe after he wrote Ridgemont High and before he wrote Say Anything. I can't remember, was it directed by Art Linson? Is that who directed it? So it was directed by Art Linson, the very famous producer who produced a lot of, The Untouchables and also I think directed, I should have checked this stuff before I came here, I think he directed Where the Buffalo Roam with Bill Murray, which...
You're smart.
It's just, I just
no
spent
wonder you're such a good director.
Way too many. Well, my approach to directing is truly to sort of getting to your point about making people feel like you've got their back. It's really just that I'm a fan. I mean, I'm not necessarily, I'm not Ridley Scott. Like, I'm not the world's greatest visual designer. I'm certainly not the world's greatest actor myself. In fact, I think part of the reason I'm very respectful of actors and what they do and do try to protect them is the rare occasions I've tried to act have all been disasters for everyone involved. Myself, I actually have the distinction of having been digitally removed from an episode of The Fosters because I was so unconvincing playing a guy walking down the street. They literally I was on the set of that show and they threw me into a scene and it was a big crane shot that was the final shot of the season and they had to spend, tens of thousands of dollars removing me from the shot because I looked so awkward walking. I'm so ill at ease on camera.
That is really distinctive.
Yeah,
that's impressive.
Yeah, I've been the only thing I can do as an actor. I was told once by Greg Kinnear that I have the best dead eye stare in the business. I can play a corpse. I used to do that for him on Talk Soup because that was my first job when I came out here to go to film school. Was I worked on Talk Soup when Greg Kinnear was the host, and so they would always throw me into skits when they needed a dead body. So that's the only thing I can do. But
that's difficult. I understand.
But yeah, I come in as a fan, and I'm a fan again. I'm a fan of the Wildlife, which is this kind of. It's kind of the way they marketed it at the time was it was as a sequel to Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which it really wasn't. It was kind of a spiritual companion piece, as they say, sort of like Linklater's Everybody Wants Some was a spiritual companion piece to Dazed and Confused. I think, Wildlife, it was basically the same kinds of Cameron Crowe characters and relationships, but in, post-high school life versus high school. And anyway, I always thought that your performance in that movie, you really had a kind of vulnerability, in this movie that was kind of marketed as, again, like a kind of wild teen sex comedy or something. It's got some really serious, sad moments, and you're the man. I can't remember. Is it Hart Bachner?
Yeah, you have a good memory. Yeah, Hart Bachner.
Just was such a.
He was my neighbor.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. That's he was funny, and that was my a movie I did with Eric Stoltz.
Right.
My first movie I did with Eric Stoltz. He was I was learning then. I was trying to do different parts, and it's really interesting thinking about these things in perspective, because my daughters are actresses, and Zoe and Maddie Deutsch, and she's been working for a number of years, since she was 16, and now she's 22. And, I think about her career and where it's going and how she approaches her career. And it kind of makes me kind of relive the way I did it. And, of course, it's a completely different perspective, which she acknowledges, because, she has me, and I had nobody, I had nobody I didn't understand the business. I didn't understand being an actor. I was just a girl trying to, make a living, really. I had nobody to back me up. When I moved to New York when I was 16, I had nobody to write the check if I ran out of money. Like, there was nothing, So I'm interested in her, the way she does it, and I'm interested in thinking about, how I've had a lot of longevity. But as soon as I had babies, I was done with my movie career. Like, the studio movies were done with me, and I want to make sure that doesn't happen to her or to Maddie. However, Maddie decides to go, whether she decides to go with the acting or the writing. But writing is obviously better. But it was shocking to me to, like, I literally have done one studio movie since I did. What would it be? The Little Rascals was my last studio movie.
I think so.
I don't understand how that happens to somebody who makes movies that make money. The Little Rascals, every movie most of the movies big features I made, and it's such a brutal business, and I want to somehow figure out a way to outsmart it, or hope that Zoe can outsmart it.
Well, that's an interesting point. I was actually surprised in preparing for this. I just kind of looked over your filmography, and it's, in a way I was kind of surprised. You've been in a lot of movies, but I was still surprised in a way by how few you had been in for how big your career seemed, just because you happened to have been in a few in the 80s that hit. I mean, I don't know if they were necessarily all huge hits at the time, but Back to the Future was. But you've been in several movies that just have really permeated the culture. I mean, including, even a movie that wasn't popular at the time, like Howard the Duck. Now it's got all these fans and people talk about. I mean, that was actually the first thing when I, talked to my editor at Talk House about doing this podcast. The one movie he brought up, make sure you ask her about Howard the Duck. But, looking over it, it's like Back to the Future, Howard the Duck, Some Kind of Wonderful. Red Dawn is another one that
hugely popular. And I mean, people, they've definitely, there's so many movies that die, like no one cares about, and they still have fan bases and people who, they still have I just did a DVD extra feature. They paid for my hair and makeup and a really good guy to do it for Space Camp.
Right.
Like, they're releasing that in Blu-ray. So,
Yeah.
and that was a bomb. So, and that was made 30 years ago. So obviously somebody likes it, because they don't release those things. It costs too much money. So, yeah, you're right. And it is a mystery to me. You would think somebody would have resurrected me for something.
Well, that's what I'm just kind of curious.
Because there's fans. All these guys are fans. Like, Turturro will be like, "Oh my God, I love you. You're so great. You're like one of the greats." I'm like, "Give me a job." It's really weird. I mean, I know I've worked constantly on TV, and I made that choice, but it's bizarre. I'm waiting. Or maybe I'll just have to direct myself in a big feature.
Well, so if you had been, you went through all these years without getting a studio movie, how did Clint Eastwood's J. Edgar come about? Because that kind of just came out of nowhere.
Yeah, I really don't know. And I went and auditioned and wore diamonds, and they gave me the job. But it was weird. But I've been expecting that kind of stuff to happen all the time. But I guess what happens is there's so few parts in big features now that they just automatically go to women who have Academy Award nominations.
Right.
Because there's a bunch of those.
Yeah, Melissa Leo's gonna.
Yeah.
She's taking all of your parts.
Yeah. Whatever. Yeah. I think that's just, they go through the list of the Academy Award people. Because I have fans, It's a mystery to me, really. It is honestly a strange thing. Not that it's not that terrible to me, but only when I'm doing one of these interviews about my movies that I did 155 million years ago, to me, do I start thinking about it, and it kind of like makes me sad that you can't talk about a movie I've done in a while. I mean, I've probably done 20 independent movies in the kind of weird age that we're at, where only serious kind of interesting movies are made independently, and they kind of disappear into the ethers, or like people don't really see them.
Yeah.
So I feel like I've made a few really interesting ones. I've made a few interesting ones this year. You know, but I feel like they just kind of melt into the ethers in a way. But I still had fun making them, and some people see them and really like them. They're not really, most of the ones that I've made are not really genre movies, so they're harder to click in.
I have to say something about your movie that stood out for me. I just watched it again yesterday, and the thing I really like about it is it doesn't have the confined feeling that most independent films nowadays do, mine included, because now most of the time nowadays you do have such limited time and resources that everybody just kind of makes these movies that take place in one room, and even all the horror movies and stuff like that, they all take place in a basement or something. And I was really impressed with how Near Spectacular Men, with how kind of broad it is in terms of the number of locations, the number of scenes, it feels like a real movie. It feels sort of like a Woody Allen or Nora Ephron movie or something from the 80s. It doesn't feel like a movie where you were straining against your resources, even though I know you were. And I mean, the cinematography in it, wasn't familiar with this guy, Brian Koss, is that his name, who shot it? But I mean, the cinematography in it is just fantastic. I mean, it's a really sort of great, and I really liked that you went for a kind of more formally composed, lit, I think there's been this whole movement in independent filmmaking, and even more so in television, this whole idea that you just handhold everything, and it drives me completely nuts, because I feel like it's become such a cliche, and people think, oh, if it's handheld, it's more real or something like that, and which I've never understood. And I also think it's kind of lazy filmmaking, because if everything's handheld, then it doesn't mean anything. Like, the handheld only means something if it's in contrast with something else. And anyway,
I agree.
The point is, I think with yours, your movie has a much more sort of classical style to it that you and the cinematographer brought to it. And I think that it kind of made, as an audience member, I sit back and I just kind of relaxed when I watched it, because it was like, okay, like, I'm in good hands here, and I can kind of get sucked into it in a way that I really liked. So anyway, it's kind of a long-winded way of just paying you a compliment.
I appreciate that. It was a really specific idea, because I knew that even though I was making an indie movie, that it was actually daring to shoot it the way I shot it, because people aren't used to it anymore. They're like, oh, this is conventional. And I wanted it to be conventionally unconventional.
Right.
I think that by shooting it in a way that makes, like you said, relax, that's conventional, then it's more fun. It's funnier to see the other things that are happening, and to see a story unfold that is uniquely modern and written by an actual 23-year-old woman, like that's her real perspective on things. That's a modern idea, because that just doesn't happen in a conventional movie. It was always, men writing that stuff, or, in a great case of Nora Ephron. But so I wanted it to be conventionally beautiful and have a take on millennials that was more of like a more, I don't know, classic look. And I just thought it would be more interesting. And I knew it was daring, and to shoot it with the anamorphic lenses to make it like wider, so you could kind of catch the comedy widely. To put the subjects in the middle of the frame all the time was a very kind of weird choice that I made, and to try to balance a lot of the shots, like very balanced, and it was strange. It was also really hard to cut it, because cutting between close-ups, everything had to match in a way that was really hard. Not like the way you shot the movie, which was our movie, The Trouble with the Truth, with the two cameras shooting at the same time was such a great thing. Even though you also chose to shoot it very classically.
Oh, yeah.
You know, but the 2 cameras at the same time was an amazing experience. Like for an actor, that's the best thing in the world.
Yeah.
Because you can kind of like improv emotionally. You can cry on one take at the same time. You laugh at the next one, and you know that you're not leaving the other actor high and dry.
Right.
Being like, what are you doing? I didn't react to what you just did.
Yeah.
I can't remember what you just did. So the making of our movie was super unique, and I would love to make a movie like that.
Yeah, I love doing
impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I love doing the multiple camera thing. I don't really, partly, honestly, is because I'm lazy and it cuts down on the time, you have to
edit it, for sure.
but also, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it really it frees the actors up so much. And some cinematographers resist it, because it compromises their lighting or and all that. But I've kind of lost patience with that argument from cinematographers ever since I read an interview with Ridley Scott where he said he shot the battle scenes in Robin Hood with 14 cameras. And so I'm kind of like, all right, if Ridley Scott can make Robin Hood look the way it looked with 14 cameras, I don't want to hear somebody bitching to me about using 2. But
yeah, that is it's a weird thing, and it's incredibly useful. Incredibly useful. I just couldn't. I had to choose between the anamorphic lenses and the 2 cameras. So,
well, something else I want to touch on before we wrap up is the whole idea of acting with special effects, because you were Howard the Duck and the Back to the Future movies. You've been in some kind of what are now thought of as huge special effects movies, and I guess I'm very curious about the whole Howard the Duck experience, because we never really talked about it, but I just remember you in passing when you were doing Trouble with the Truth mentioning that, oh yeah, we were shooting that movie for 6 months, which, to me it sounds like absolute hell. I mean, I can't
Torture.
imagine, being on the same movie for 6 months. And I mean, I'm curious, was that because of the effects? I mean, was it because of the duck? Was it because of what? Well,
actually, I shot a total of five movies that took 6 months.
Really?
All 3 Back to the Futures took 6 months each.
Wow.
Dennis the Menace took 6 months. No one knows why that happened. And Howard the Duck. Wow. And so, yeah, it was a nightmare. Howard the Duck, we shot 1 scene for 3 weeks.
Wow.
The scene where we're in like the sushi bar, sushi place, I don't know, and the Dark Overlord takes over and destroys the whole set. The joke was, we got to the POV of the ketchup, and I was like, no, we can't have the POV of the ketchup. Please, we've done every shot possible. And I had to tell the same little cute little puns,
right,
about 100 million times. It's impossible to be funny. But yeah, that movie, it was, I think, 3 weeks for the whole end sequence where we were in this freezing cold, big, giant thing. But this was, the dark ages of special effects. Another movie that actually was really impressive that way was Red Dawn. There were no special effects in that movie. Everything blew up. Everything, everything happened in real time. And that movie took a really long time. We had to wait for snow for 3 weeks. We just sat there waiting for snow for 3 weeks. I went back to visit the hotel, and the hotel was like, thank God, we were just opened. And because you guys had to sit and wait for 3 weeks, and mostly everybody just drank in the bar, we stayed open. But yeah, the special effects in Howard the Duck were really, really difficult. And they were really difficult to act with because the duck always broke. So that my nickname was Dawn, because they would wait to do my close-up till dawn. And I was like, I'm the leading lady. I'm supposed to look pretty. But they would always worry about the duck and his mouth moving. And every time a plane went over, or like someone opened a car door or something, it would go, the face would go crazy in the middle of a take. And they had I think it was an 8-year-old boy or I can't remember, inside that suit. So that was also really difficult because it would take him an hour, 45 minutes to get into the suit. We could only keep him there for like an hour.
Yeah.
It was very uncomfortable and awful for this poor little guy. And then take him out, so it was like a nightmare, honestly. But it was fun acting, with Tim Robbins, who never owns up to this movie, but he was really fun to work with.
Well, when you came on to that movie, I mean, how was it presented to you? Did you think you were getting into something that was just going to be a huge phenomenon? Because it was produced by George Lucas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you're coming onto this, big George Lucas comic book movie. I mean, what were your expectations for it before you started?
It was massive,
Yeah.
and then I was coming off of Back to the Future, so I was a big star, so I was on their short list, but I remember my audition, and I remember looking for all the clothes and stuff, trying to look like Madonna, trying to buy the rock star stuff to wear and sing. I mean, that was cool. I was going to get to be a rock star and sing, although they held it out till the end. Like, we might redo your voice. It was so obnoxious. But yeah, it was, and also I never got a day off. I was always working and rehearsing and learning how to play the guitar and recording. And it was really a really hard shoot. Yeah, everyone thought it was going to be a big hit, even till the end, because they were looking for the voice of Howard and they were auditioning everybody. They could have had Robin Williams. They could have had Jay Leno. And that's what I kept saying, because I could tell. The comedy, it was very hard to do that comedy with the puppeteer going, yes, Beverly, it is great to see you. I would be like, you're killing the comedy. It's like a nightmare. I was like, recut the movie, let Jay Leno go, let Robin Williams go,
right,
and just stay on my reaction or the back of the duck or whatever, just let it go. And we all knew that the technical problems of making the duck were going to ruin the movie, because it just was really hard. The comedy was hard to do, So then later, when Bob Zemeckis did Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I had a really long conversation with him about that. And I think I helped inspire him to get an actor on the set for the whole time, because a really great, funny actor, because we can't hold up balls, comedy is a souffle. You have to have life in it. And that's why I'm proud of that performance. I carry that duck up my back, dragged him up a hill. Yeah. Because in terms of the comedy and making him seem real and making it seem like it was a fun adventure, it was really hard.
Well, and I would imagine when the movie came out and was not successful, that it was probably fairly crushing at the time. And yet, in a way, if I have the story right, Howard the Duck's failure was probably the best thing that ever happened to you personally, because it made you do Some Kind of Wonderful, where you met your husband, Howard Deutsch. Is that true? I mean, because I think I'd heard that you originally turned down Some Kind of Wonderful, and then when Howard the Duck flopped, you thought, oh shit, maybe I better do this movie. Yeah,
it was brutal. Yeah, it was brutal. And I did. I turned it down, and then I took it back because I was like, I better get a job, because I was shivering in my house. It was so mean. The things that people were saying were so mean. No one sets out to make a bad movie.
Right.
You don't have to be so brutal when you're talking about something. I mean, and I have to say that to myself. I should say that to myself all the time. But it was, I think I knew that was kind of the end of something for me, like my ability to be a real, to work with really good people, I think might have really died with that movie. Now I look back on it, maybe that's why, I don't like to say that, but it's probably true. And so it was a really bad moment for me. Not that I was surprised. You get a sinking feeling oftentimes when you go to the first table read and you're like, what? That's not going to work. And I definitely had a sinking feeling, when I saw how the duck was and how it was so hard to make the comedy work, But, a lot of people really love the movie, and I really love those fans. And, I am not embarrassed of my performance. I think I did my job well, and made a duck look kind of sexy and made people really uncomfortable, But I always appreciated things that were slightly off. And I brought that to my movie, The Year of Spectacular Men. I have a very particular, strange sense of humor and humanity. And I think that that's a gift that I can bring to my directing that I also that's why I loved Back to the Future. It was such a twisted, bizarre story. And I've always had that.
It's funny, I was talking with Joe Dante, and he was telling me that, he was around at the time Back to the Future was being made. I guess he was friends with Spielberg and Zemeckis and all that kind of thing. And he was saying, they were all very, very nervous about that movie before it came out. The studio was very nervous about, the whole, that it's, essentially comedy about a wholesome family comedy about incest, you know. And it's funny, and it's kind of, I think people almost forget, people don't pay attention to how weird that movie. And Zemeckis is kind of the master of that. I mean, his movies, he's kind of the master of combining things in his movies in a way where the true dark, weird heart of them, because he's got a very dark sense of humor, him and Gail. And I feel like they really figured out how to package their sort of dark, twisted sensibility in a, mainstream friendly package.
It is interesting. Just the times we live in right now, like what people focus on is so bizarre. Like, so you can go like over here and do that, like it's really interesting to me. And yeah, the way people see that character is like, you were so innocent. Yeah. I'm like, no, she was demented.
Yeah.
Not just demented in the fact that she wanted to have sex with her son, but just demented in her, like the way she saw the world. She was a crazy character and a great character. Like, I often say I've had 3 or 4 great parts, one of them being your movie, The Trouble with the Truth, and Back to the Future, and then I did Sally Bowles on Broadway, and they all have these, you think that they're one thing, and then they're another thing, which is great. There's so few complex female roles, and definitely Lorraine McFly is like the craziest character.
Well, it's funny, I really love Some Kind of Wonderful. It's actually another one of my favorite movies of yours, but did you turn that down initially because that part wasn't as complex initially? I mean, because I feel like she is a sort of more complex character than you normally would get in that type of movie. But was that always there from the beginning, or was that something that you and Howie brought to it more?
Yeah, it was a completely different script when I turned it down the first time. And that's a part of the story that's kind of interesting. But and then Howie quit the movie, and then do you remember the director that took over? Did Martha Coolidge or somebody?
I'm trying to think. I feel like somebody like that was involved with it at some point.
And she redeveloped the script and made it darker. And then she was let go, and then Howie came back. So actually, we probably owe her a debt of gratitude for that. And I just thought of that. I should say that to her. But yeah, the character was, the reason I turned it down was that it was obviously the second lead. The other girl was the better part, and Mary Stuart Masterson's part was a better part. Certainly on the page, it doesn't seem quite so much on the screen, but on the page it was a much better part, and that would have been the part I really wanted to do. I was trying to build my career in a certain way, so I wasn't really in the mood to take that part. So anyway, but I am glad because I met my husband Howie, and now we're both directors, and we get to compare notes, and it's fun.
Thanks for sitting down with me and doing this, Leah. It's been great.
Thank you. It's fun to talk to you with mics.
And it's always fun to talk to you, Ellie Einhorn, with mics or with no mics.
Nick Dawson, you as well. Thank you to our listeners, and thank you to Jim and Leah for today's conversation.
Absolutely. And if you're in LA this Friday, You're a Spectacular Man, LA Film Festival, be there.
Thank you so much to our listeners who take the time to head to iTunes and Stitcher and rate us there. If you enjoy the podcast, the more you rate us, the more other people get to hear it.
And we get to do more episodes like this, recorded by Susan Vallett.
Mixed and co-produced by Mark Yoshizumi.
The man himself.
Tomorrow on the podcast, Teenage Fan Club's Norman Blake in conversation with Riley Walker.
I will be listening to that one, for sure. Till then, I'm Nick Dawson.
I'm Elia Einhorn. Thanks for listening.